My dad walked out on us, and my mother's new fiancé didn't want to adopt me. My mother told me to figure it out. It all started when my dad unexpectedly left our family. He had always been a workaholic, rarely spending time with me or my mom, but his departure still shocked me. My mom didn't tell me until after he had already moved out. By then, they had filed for divorce, citing that my dad was overwhelmed by everything. He didn't even say goodbye in person, just sent a brief text telling me to be good. Since then, my parents have separated, with my mom getting full custody of my brother and me. My dad has visiting rights but hasn't used them, and I haven't seen him since. Just when I was trying to adjust to life without my dad, my mom dropped another bombshell. She had been dating a guy named Robert for 3 months, and they were engaged. The news overwhelmed me. I barely had time to process that she was seeing someone new before she announced that he would soon be my stepdad. I felt like 5 months was too short to truly know someone, but my mom assured me it would be fine. 2 weeks later, I met Robert. He was distant and aloof with me but playful with my 4-year-old brother. I initially thought it was because my brother was so young, making it easier for Robert to connect with him. However, 2 weeks after that, my mom revealed something that shattered my view of the situation. My mom sat me down and explained that she and Robert had gotten engaged so quickly because he had been offered a great job, which required them to move out of state. They planned to leave me with my grandmother, believing I wouldn't want to leave everything behind. But I told her I was willing to move away if it meant staying with her. I had already lost my dad and didn't want to lose her too. However, she insisted it was better for me to stay because my school and friends were here. Eventually, she admitted that Robert only wanted to take my brother because he was young enough to bond with, while I was too old and wouldn't truly be his daughter. He also didn't like that I had voiced concerns about their quick engagement, thinking I was stuck in the past when my parents were together. My mom shared his views and decided it was best for me to stay behind. Hearing this from my mom hurt deeply. I expected her to be on my side, not to abandon me for Robert's sake. Although I love my grandmother and have no problem living with her, it felt like my mom was choosing Robert over me. I tried to argue, but it was no use. I decided to move in with my grandmother immediately, not wanting to wait until they left. The move couldn't be arranged that same day, but within a few days, I was packed and ready to go. My mom tried to reassure me that she still loved me and was only looking out for herself, wanting to give herself a shot at happiness. But for the last few days at home, I didn't speak to her. I didn't even say goodbye when I left, only to my little brother, whom I'll miss. Since moving in with my grandma, she has been incredibly supportive. She's my mom's mother, and she thinks what my mom is doing is terrible. Life with my grandma has been pretty easy, and apart from the time it takes to commute to school, everything is going well. I keep in touch with my brother and call my mom every evening just to speak to him, though she and I don't talk. 3 days ago, I celebrated my birthday at my grandma's place. She organized a small party, inviting a few close friends from school and some relatives she found on Facebook. My 15th birthday started on a low note, as I'd been feeling down since my mom dropped me off at my grandmother's place. But after we cut the cake, my grandma surprised me with an incredible gift. She transferred the ownership of her penthouse apartment to me. For now, her lawyer would act as the trustee, but when I turn 18, it would be all mine. This was the best news I'd received in a long time, and I had no intention of sharing it with my mother. However, someone from the party must have told her, because the next day she called to say that she and Robert had decided he wanted to adopt me, on the condition that I convinced my grandma to transfer the property to him. She actually expected me to be happy about this, thinking it would mean I could finally join them. I was anything but happy and told her I wouldn't do it, then hung up. When she called again, I didn't pick up, so she texted me instead. In the text, she apologized for trying to live by Robert's rules but explained that after her divorce, he was the only one there for her emotionally and financially. She reminded me that my dad wasn't very generous, and the settlement and child support were minimal. Despite extra shifts at work, she struggled to maintain our lifestyle, but Robert stepped in to help. She acknowledged he hadn't been kind to me but said it was because of past trauma involving relationships with children. She also emphasized that she knew I'd be well cared for by my grandmother, so she didn't feel like she was abandoning me. Finally, she urged me to think about her happiness and to do what Robert expected so we could be together. That message initially softened me, but the last part made me angry. It felt like my mother had lost her individuality, expecting me to do everything Robert wanted. I responded after half an hour, firmly telling her that I wouldn't do what Robert asked and that she could move away with him as planned. I was disappointed in her behavior and had nothing more to say. When I discussed it with my grandma, she reassured me that she had no intention of transferring the property to Robert. She didn't trust him, and she was sure he'd sell the apartment without giving me a dime. So, it was good that I hadn't agreed to my mom's request. But my mom wasn't ready to take no for an answer. This morning, she showed up at my grandma's place with my brother. Luckily, I was at school when she arrived, but when I got home, my grandma filled me in on the purpose of her visit. She wanted to talk to me in person about the proposition I'd rejected. I clarified that I hadn't ignored her. I had replied clearly that I wouldn't convince my grandma to transfer the property. My tone was curt, but I felt justified. My mom started crying, saying she was just trying to make everyone happy, but nothing seemed to work. I was furious because I felt like I was the one being treated poorly by both my parents. I told her to stop crying and said she had it all backward. She wasn't trying to make everyone happy, just herself, and expected everyone to bend over backward for her. I wasn't willing to do that. I had my own life ahead of me and wasn't going to ruin it by trying to please her. My words seemed to shock her, and she left soon after. Later, I realized she had blocked me, and now I feel guilty about what I said. So, I'm asking, AITA for telling my mother she was selfish and only cared about her happiness? Update. Hi everyone, first of all, thank you to everyone who commented on my original post. Your insights opened my eyes, and I realized there were many points I hadn't considered. It hadn't even occurred to me that my mother's relationship with Robert might have been going on even before the divorce. I've been thinking a lot about my mother since she cut off contact after our last argument. It's possible she's only telling us certain things now because it's convenient for her after the divorce, and we might never have known otherwise. I never imagined my mother could cheat, but now, I'm not so sure. It's not really my business anymore, though. The only thing that bothers me is that I can't talk to my brother, whom I miss a lot. We've always gotten along well, and I hate the thought that he might be Robert's child, as some people have suggested. I'm trying not to think about it, but now that the idea is out there, it's hard to ignore. I've discussed these possibilities with my grandmother over the past few days. While we haven't reached any conclusions, it's become difficult to think of my mother in the same way. I feel like talking to my father might give us some insight, but I'm not sure if he would want to discuss it. It's been 4 days since my mother visited us, and we haven't heard from her since. On the first day, she blocked me, and later my grandmother told me she'd blocked her too. It's ungrateful, considering my grandmother has been taking care of me without expecting any child support from my mother. My grandmother has her own money, and it's purely out of kindness and love for me that she's been looking after me. My mother should be grateful, but instead, she's blocked her. I'm angry and have so many unanswered questions. I just hope the truth comes out eventually. Update 2. Today, my father came by to visit. My grandmother had contacted him, though she hadn't told me because she didn't want to give me false hope. I was surprised to see him, and even more surprised when he hugged me and apologized for everything. He sat down and told my grandmother and me everything he knew. He explained that he and my mother had started falling out of love a long time ago but stayed together for my sake, not wanting to put me through the trauma of coming from a broken home. About 3 years ago, my dad began an affair with a coworker. He wanted to tell my mother but never found the courage. She eventually found out about it a year ago and filed for divorce. She agreed to keep quiet about it on the condition that he would leave the house to her, give her full custody, and agree to an exorbitant settlement and child support. He also wouldn't be allowed to visit us until she said it was okay. He agreed to all of it because he didn't want me to think of him as a cheater. My father apologized for always being a workaholic and never building a strong bond with me. He said it wasn't an excuse, but my mother always wanted more, and he had to work all the time to afford the lifestyle she desired. It's hard to come to terms with, but I kind of understand. He told me that my grandmother had mentioned Robert by name in a message, which is why he rushed over. Apparently, he knew Robert well from their college days and wanted to warn us about him. My parents and Robert were all part of the same circle in college. My parents were together, but Robert always had a crush on my mother. The night before graduation, they were out drinking, and Robert confessed his feelings. My mother rejected him, but a few weeks later, she told my dad she was confused about her feelings, and they went on a break for almost 2 months. During that time, my dad's friends told him that she had gone on a date with Robert, but it didn't go well, and she eventually returned to my dad. After they patched things up, my dad asked her to cut Robert off, which she agreed to at first. Later that year, my dad found out she hadn't cut him off, leading to a huge fight. Robert even showed up at my dad's apartment, and they ended up in a physical brawl. After that, my mother finally cut Robert off, but my dad said Robert was always unhinged and never up to any good. Now, my dad thinks my mother and Robert must have reconnected a couple of years ago. If they're engaged, it means she's been cheating on him too, and all the conditions she set are null and void. My dad wants to confront my mother, but I asked him to wait until I spoke to her first. I'm still trying to process everything, it's complicated, and I don't know who to believe. Neither of my parents has been good to me, and it's just really messy. Update 3. I finally spoke to my mother. I didn't tell her about my meeting with my father because I wanted to hear what she had to say first. Since she blocked me, I had no choice but to visit her unannounced. When I showed up at her door, she seemed surprised but still invited me in. Thankfully, Robert wasn't home, so I could speak to her freely. I apologized to her initially, just to get her to open up. I told her I was finding it difficult to accept Robert into our family so soon, which is why I'd been acting out. I finally confronted my mother about Robert, hinting that it didn't make sense how quickly she'd found someone as perfect as him after her divorce. I gave her a chance to come clean about knowing him from college, but she didn't. Instead, she just said she was lucky to have found him. I knew my dad had been truthful about them all being friends in college, and when my mother lied, I knew who to trust. She made things worse by admitting she had rushed into the engagement with Robert to erase every trace of my father from her life. Then, she told me about my father's affair, the one thing she had made him sacrifice everything to keep secret. After that, I saw no reason to stay, so I left and called my father, telling him he was free to do whatever he wanted because I now knew the truth. I'm not saying my dad is suddenly innocent, but at least he's not as bad as my mom. Update 4. Everyone was concerned about whether my brother was my dad's child, and so was I. Last month, after my dad confronted my mother, they conducted a paternity test, and thankfully, my brother is indeed my dad's kid. Now, my dad is fighting for full custody. Since I'm 15, my preference for him to have full custody will be considered, but I'm still living with my grandmother for now. Even though my dad is trying to fix things, there are many issues we need to work on. Until then, I feel more secure with my grandmother. My mother was furious when she found out my visit was just to uncover the truth about her and Robert. She unblocked me once to curse me out, then blocked me again, and we haven't spoken since. As for Robert, he dumped my mother as quickly as he had gotten engaged to her once he found out my dad was fighting to reduce alimony and child support. Apparently, Robert had been lying to my mother all along, there was no job offer. His plan was to join his uncle's struggling business and use my mother's money to fund it. That's why he wanted her to convince me to transfer the property my grandmother had gifted to me. They had been together for 2 years, and he had been stringing her along the whole time. My mother was utterly betrayed, but instead of being ashamed, she's been bad-mouthing Robert to all her friends. She doesn't realize they've been gossiping about her, which is how my dad and eventually I found out. I'm just thankful that my mother decided she wanted nothing to do with me as soon as Robert said the word, because I would hate to be stuck with her right now. My dad and I have decided to work on our relationship. He's promised to be a better father, and once he gets full or even shared custody of my brother, we're going to try to be a happy, functional family. I'm not sure about the functional part, but we'll at least try to be happy.